often said this. I mean, are people going to get married when they know that marriage is forever? Like, and I mean forever. You know, we say forever now.
Zoltan Istvan is a transhumanist, a journalist, entrepreneur, and libertarian futurist. In this episode, we talk with Zoltan about why he drove around the US in a coffin-shaped bus when running against Trump and Clinton in the last US election as a third-party candidate, why he thinks technology can eventually help us eliminate biological death, and how living longer could fundamentally change society and the traditions we have become accustomed to. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com. Now, this episode, a mission to eliminate death.
You drove a coffin-shaped bus, I believe, across America, and you were campaigning against death. Can you give us a little bit of background about that?
You know, I was running for president, and, you know, in terms of what I'm all about, the most important thing to me is trying to overcome death with science and technology. Mm-hmm. And when you're running for president as a third-party candidate, it's very hard to get attention. Yeah. So you need to essentially create some kind of media environment where everyone's interested in your work. It would make a lot of sense to have, because you have to have a bus tour, you have to go around the country talking to people. And so I said, well, what kind of vehicle can really get a lot of attention? And so we thought, let's get a bus, but how do we make it? First, we wanted to make a microscope. I said, everyone will pay attention, say, this is the science candidate. But actually, then we thought about it and said, a coffin. A coffin will really get the attention of everybody. And since our number one goal is really to extend lives, I mean, that was the promise I was making to Americans, I will make you live forever. A coffin represents that in a kind of ironic, wacky, attention-getting way. And of course, it worked brilliantly. We were, everywhere we went, people wanted to hear what was happening, come on the bus, see what was going on. And it really ignited a conversation about death. You know, most people in America didn't realize 2 years ago when I ran for president that we were going to try to be able to overcome death with science and technology. A lot of people don't know about it. Now, all of a sudden, they do know about it.
So is it like the candidates, they make like crazy promises, like sometimes. So when you say we can overcome death, is it like this political promises, or can we actually do this?
The question is, will you overcome death before the wall is built? That's what I want to know.
Well, I don't think the wall will ever be built. I think that was just what a lot of people would say is that the amount of money going into life extension technologies right now is minimal. I mean, it's hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's already much better than it was 2 or 3 years ago. You know, my plan was saying, look, if we bring in $1 trillion within a 10-year time frame, we can eliminate most types of death, most types of heart disease, most types of cancer, most types of whatever happens to you. And we'll probably have a very good shot with the $1 trillion of reversing aging. Now, $1 trillion at the time when I was saying this would have been more about, I don't know, like at least 50 times the amount of money that was in the field to begin with. So it was a dramatic increase of the amount of money and resources being put into this field. And I still think that amount of money would be able to come very close to solving biological death under most circumstances, as well as stopping or reversing aging. And we've never put money like that into this field, and that's the problem. We put money into all sorts of different types of medicines, which are not necessarily designed to cure you, but designed to keep you alive and then die. We call it Band-Aid medicine. It's in everyone's best interest to not cure you of a disease, but to keep you sick for an extended period of time. Like heart disease, they don't want to eliminate the disease because people make money, the companies, from it. So it's best to keep you sort of sick for 20 years paying all this money. Whereas my tactic of dealing with heart disease is absolutely 100% replace the heart. The heart is a pump. The heart is an organ that can be replaced with robotics or bionics or something of that nature. And we ought to spend that kind of money on literally getting rid of the biological aspect of it. This is dramatically different than the way most medical companies, pharmaceutical companies, healthcare attacks the problem.
It's almost very William Gibsonish almost. It's that cybernetics or the kind of way of replacing parts with hardware, for want of a better word.
And especially, you have to understand that when you walk out in the street or you look at your family or anyone you know, a third of everybody dies from heart disease, a third. So if you're in an auditorium watching a sporting event, just take a third of them and just say, okay, those people are going to die from heart disease. It's not a difficult thing to actually change it. Really, there hasn't been much incentive because, and now we can get into the religious question, but, you know, America is the majority of it believers and have an afterlife, and they don't have an incentive to live indefinitely. You know, our Congress, all 535 members of U.S. Congress, all 9 Supreme Court justices, our president, our vice president, you can go down the list. Everybody believes in an afterlife. They have no reason to eliminate death or to stop heart disease. You know, we have a very different medical perspective in the transhumanist community. We want to end suffering 100%. Like, the goal is to end suffering, literally. We want to get rid of the biology that causes a lot of the problems in the first place. I don't want to be dependent upon breathing air, dependent upon eating, or dependent upon drinking, or dependent upon using the restroom. When you look at where the human race is going and how we're dealing with death, we're going to be dealing with it by getting rid of major parts of the body in order to be much stronger entities. Like, if you were God, you would never create a human being full of biological flesh that needs to breathe air and is suffer. If it doesn't have it for a minute, it dies. This is not how we're creating machines. We create them so they're dependent on the most functional strategies possible. We'd like to integrate that technology into our bodies, and we are very slowly, but over the next 10, 20 years, probably much more quickly.
So I like the fact that when you say end suffering, I'm with you 100%. For me, this is a marvelous goal. Now, when you talk about biology, you know, this is what makes us human, and this is where I have some, you know, it's difficult for me. Can you just like change parts of us? Can you change things like that and replace? What will we become after that? Are we still human? Are we still, because as human we breathe, as human we go to the toilet, as human we eat. You know, this is what makes us life. So who are we after that?
To replace the heart, for example. I mean, some major things we can replace and then live already 20, 30 years longer. Like, if you replace your heart, you won't know the difference. So far, when people have replaced arms, like war victims that got a limb blown off and they put a robotic arm, their personalities haven't changed. In fact, sometimes they said that some of the studies say they become more empathetic or nicer because all of a sudden they've sort of been humbled and they realize the world is a difficult place. So, but I think, you know, you can do anything you want to the human body, or most anything, but as long as you don't mess with your human mind, you still are going to be that same person. But at some point, if you go over 50% cyborg parts, maybe then, like you said, if you stop eating, how does that change your perspective? When you stop having the senses, you know, how does that change your perspective? Let's try to take another look. When these people, the war veterans, have an arm blown off and they get a robotic arm, right now the robotic arm is not, it's sophisticated. So you can grab a glass of water and drink with it. In 5 years, maybe even less, that robotic arm is going to be like a science lab, and you're going to heat your water to 100 degrees very quickly. You're going to cool it down. You won't need ice cubes. You'll be able to see in the dark because you'll have infrared, technology. You'll be able to determine all, what I'm trying to say is your senses will become modified and much greater because of a single instrument attached to your body that makes you feel things. Like, the human eye right now only sees 1% of the light spectrum. Whatever you see, you only see 1%. Means 99% of the universe is blind to you. When you have a robotic eye, you're going to start seeing maybe 60 or 70% already. This opens up new senses of interpretation, psychologically, philosophically. Yes, we want to end suffering, but we also want to explore, be adventurous, expand our perspectives. The fact that we have 5 senses, we might have 10 or 20 or 100 senses in the future with robotic and bionic apparatus. It's not just about ending suffering. It's also about expanding one's perspective and maybe becoming a very, very different and more intelligent, more empathetic. Like I said before, maybe machines in our bodies will make us love each other much more. Maybe the real love of humanity is actually in a hive mind where we're all interconnected and we feel, I mean, I'm not saying that's the case. What I'm saying is we need to understand that our experience and our perception of the world might grow dramatically through the use of this technology, both in our bodies and also in our minds.
The idea of living longer, at first glance, I don't think many people are going to say, oh, no, I don't want that. I think everyone's going to say, yeah, let's live longer. I think the question that comes up then is, what kind of shift would that have on things like our values, for example? That's just, as we get older, maybe we stop doing some of the things when we're younger because of the impact it's having on our body. We start looking after our health a bit more. If we take away that worry in some ways about our health, could it lead to maybe a loss of values or leading to a more hedonistic kind of lifestyle?
I think hedonistic is the key word. I've often said this. I mean, are people going to get married when they know that marriage is forever? Like, and I mean forever. You know, we say forever now, but marriage right now is really 30, 40, 50 years till your partner dies. And the same thing with having children. You know, I mean, I have two daughters, a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, and it's a major responsibility. And I don't think the responsibility necessarily changes that much once they're 20. You still want to take care of them. You still visit them at Christmas time and stuff like that. Now you're talking about a 1,000-year relationship. Father and son, there's no more difference in the age group. There's no more one who's wiser or not wiser. Right now, the system is kind of like we're always at a pretty good balance. Institutions will change once people start living dramatically longer. I think people might not have children in the first 500 years of their life if they know they're going to live 1,000 years. And of course, by then, who knows what the world is going to be like. So major institutions are going to change. It's not just about even in a 20 or 30-year lifespan. The institutions that we have held holy our whole lives will really not be here. And that starts with little things just as much as the breakdown. And just because of genetic editing or even living in virtual worlds and uploading ourselves, the idea of even being male or female, I mean, these things can change, and they can change overnight in the future because of genetic editing. Like, people can already change the color of their eyes in a matter of days and then change them back. We have a lot of strange technology already. Yes, if you change back and forth all the time, we talk about some people changing, transsexuals, but what do we call someone who changes one way, then back, then goes back, and then maybe one day becomes completely asexual, and then uses genetic editing to make a 4th and 5th arm and an eye in the back of their head, and maybe different types or two sexual organs at once. We don't have terms for those things yet, but those things, because of genetic editing, are coming. And it changes, again, this, some of these institutions being radical in America, like gay marriage, but the transhumanist era of rights is much, much more complex than anything we've ever gone through. We're talking almost like a Star Wars world where people, because of genetic editing and different types of robotic enhancements and cyborgism, will be very different types of rights and ideas, institutions. It's gonna get crazy, but I think it's gonna be also very exciting if you're into that kind of thing. And really, it comes down to whether you are or not.
To me, I think it's possible to live longer, for sure. With science, with discoveries. But now you're talking about living forever, like meaning forever. And we talk to many people actually on our shows, and sometimes we say, like, shit happens, accident happens, and that's it. Basically you can try to live forever, but most of the time you can die by an accident. So how can you ensure that this? Are we talking about living longer, like thousands of years? Are we talking about living forever? That's my question here.
I'm guilty of this idea of saying, just using the word forever because it's such an easy word or immortality, which implies forever. But when I talk about living longer, I try to speak in the range of 200 to 500 years. Probably that's the amount of time out there, because we would say, flesh will still be around after 500 years. I'd be very surprised if humans decided to use any biology whatsoever. So, which means that we'd probably upload ourselves to machines, and then maybe it really is an indefinite lifespan or something. But in the interim, what we're trying to do is go from 80 years to 150, which I believe is very possible, even if we don't stop aging. I think that's quite possible just through living better and through making like things like the robotic heart and ways to stop cancer, vaccines for cancer and whatnot. After that, though, we can talk about like if you get smushed in a car accident, how do you bring back somebody who is, as flat as a pancake? Is there 3D printing? Is there, now that person's brain survived, they get just a robotic body entirely? Is there head transplants? We have people, as probably read, attempting to do head transplants sometime this year or next. These are all the different types of things that can happen. And I think we are going to get to the 150 years. I don't want to promise beyond that, because I think at that point it really comes down to merging our brains with probably some type of machine intelligence. But let's be honest, man, Elon Musk and Brian Kernel, a number of companies where I live in California are already working on these implants that literally machine interface with computers and AI. And they're growing so quickly that if you look at the trajectory of the microprocessor, it would say, and the trajectory of brain wave science, it would say probably within 10 years, you'll almost have, or at least 20 years, you'll have compatibility between the internet and your brain in real time. We won't have these wires on. We won't be looking through a camera. You and I will have this exact conversation in our heads. That, they say, is probably within 10 to 20 years. That is starting to get very radical in terms of, I know it's not about life extension, but it's in just terms of your perception of, the world. That's something pretty crazy.
Leave artistic judgments and values on the side, but Altered Carbon, the recent show on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yes, I've seen it.
The whole concept of everyone has this sort of chip thing in their neck, and if they die, as long as that's not damaged, they could be uploaded into another body. That concept of going on. I suppose it's always going to raise that question around money. It's like, how much does this cost? Is it available for everyone? Does it mean that the people with power and money are the ones who get to live forever, and it changes, has a massive effect on society because of who has exposure or a way into this?
There's two questions I always get asked, and you've nailed one of them, about longevity or indefinite lifespans, or at least trying to live forever. And that's okay, first off, if everyone lives forever, what about overpopulation? That's a good question. But the one you asked, I think, is the more important one, and the more realistic one that everybody has to deal with, and that I have to deal with. I'm not part of that 1%. I'm not super, super rich. So I worry that you have the tech titans take this technology and leave the rest of us in the dust. And then you create this kind of divide in society. I mean, it's already, there's a lot of inequality in the world, but how, it could become much worse. It could become almost a different species. How do we make sure that doesn't happen, that, 100 million people don't take this special technology and leave the rest, the 6 billion, whatever, 7 billion, in the background living in some dystopia? And, I'm a governor candidate, as a gubernatorial candidate in California. And I think we have to be very careful. We want to try to create some types of system, maybe through laws and maybe just through private enterprise, that makes it so that everyone has the opportunity, maybe through open source software or whatnot, to upgrade themselves as they wish, when they want, or for an affordable price, so that you don't get the haves and have-nots, because otherwise the divergence between the haves and have-nots can get so great, you're going to be talking about something like a primate and a human being. It's going to be so much, it's already a big divide between the rich and the poor, but it could be major. I mean, it could be much more like that person's a super god and this person's just a biological mammal. The super god just says, look, I need all you to do my bidding and my work. And we have to be careful that era doesn't happen. And transhumanism absolutely doesn't want to lead people down there. I think that's why a lot of transhumanists are very left-leaning, because they're worried about the rich using these technologies for their own good and not for the good of humanity.
What made you motivate or focus on this topic of death, actually? Is there like something like personal for you? What made you, okay, this is what I will do. I will fight death. What's your story behind?
I started off my career at National Geographic. When you're young, you do a lot of war zones, a lot of conflict zones, because it's the easiest place to sort of go and make your name. And not a lot of people want to go to war zones. And you can't really have a family and be in a war zone, because like I do now, you just wouldn't do that because it's so dangerous. So I began my career in a lot of dangerous places. I saw some terrible things. And the more terrible things I saw, the more I said I don't want to become one of those, end up like so many people I saw dead and raped and tortured and victimized. And how can we, my question as I was going through all these conflict zones as a journalist was, what kind of world can we live in that this doesn't happen? And so I thought, well, the problem with terrorism, and this has happened in the United States 2 days ago with the school shooting, is yes, it's an absolute tragedy that we have school shootings. What's also another tragedy is that we don't have a way to repair human beings who have been shot. Because if we could save them, and there's a lot of and I've written some articles about this, radical technologies out there that literally can stop bullet wounds immediately if you can get access to the technology, because most people die from bullet wounds from bleeding out. There are all sorts of things. You can have 20 bullet wounds in you. If you have some of these new technologies out there, the blood stops. The problem is it's that 10 minutes before you get that technology to them that the people die. I want to work on how, because I don't think we can ever stop terrorists and stop evil people. That's just, it's too complex and too big. But what we can do is make medicine much better. And I think that's the best way to living indefinitely, is really this kind of working on it. But I think when you ask about how I actually got to this point, the point was I saw so much tragedy as a journalist that I just simply wanted to dedicate my life to a field that could overcome that tragedy, and not overcome it like most of the nonprofits where they say, okay, let's stop war. I understand we've been saying let's stop war forever, but that's probably never going to happen. What we can do is we can stop the impacts of war. This is something that I would do. I don't want to stop guns and bullets. I want to stop the people dying from it because we don't have the right medicine. We have it. We just need to be able to apply it and quickly.
So how confident are you that you will live forever? I know that it's a dumb question, but I've heard about the 2045 or 2050. I've heard about Ray Kurzweil, about, you have all these guys said the singularity things will happen soon enough, close enough. So are we there yet? Are we on track according to the roadmap?
There's a good chance we're on track, give or take 10 years. A lot of it has to do with economics. A lot of it has to do with culture. I wouldn't be surprised if the United States Congress at some point, since it's so religious, steps in. I wrote the novel The Transhumanist Wager, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but it's really a novel about the religious right in America rising up and saying this life extension science is evil and it's against religion. And it pretty much is against religion. The basis of religion is stopping death. It is promising an afterlife if you've lived a good life. So there's no reason to stop death in the world here. But the book creates this conflict, and I'm worried that this conflict might actually happen in America, where at some point transhumanism becomes a bad word. Transhumanism becomes this thing like, oh, it's evil, it's against it. If that happens, the technology could get stopped by the government. The technology could be, the movement itself could be kind of like, like I said, we were going to come to a civil rights era when people are going to say, wow, we now have the technology to live 1,000 years. Should we allow that? And, like I said, if the government is entirely religious, they may not want to. That's dependent on how, we go. But if nothing happens, if we continue on the same capitalistic trajectory that we're on now, I'd say 2045 is a very good estimate, maybe even a little bit earlier. I think genetic editing has just come about in the last 24 or 30 months, and that's one of the most promising technologies out there now that might change how we age, why we age. And so it could even be something more like 2039, 2040, at least to the wealthy. And then I think a few years later, as this stuff becomes more affordable, hopefully to everybody, it will be, everyone will have that opportunity. But probably there'll be some major testing by 2030 on very, very wealthy people who can afford the most crazy technologies to start overcoming almost, again, it's most forms of death. It's like you said, it's not, even 100,000 years in the future, you might always have some tiny percent of, being obliterated by a black hole. But the reality is, under most circumstances, except maybe let's say a plane crash or something, you'll be able to be brought back. Like, you're not going to die in a hospital if your body's intact. I think we're going to come to that point probably in 15 or 20 years. You're not going to die from cancer, stuff like that. You're going to die from something very, very tragic, or, something like a plane crash where there's really no recovering of the body.
If you think about death as in the current setup and the part that death plays, I think it stops a lot of people doing certain things. It's if you like, it's a bit of it's a leveler. It's a deterrent almost for people doing certain things or trying certain things. If that goes away, what impact do you think that has on that fear, if you like, almost disappearing?
The good news is that a lot of the sports, like extreme sports that would keep people from doing insane things, they're still going to be there. You know, like if you're let's say a base jumper and you want to push yourself, well, if your chute doesn't open, that still might be enough to kill you even 20, 30 years in the future, because you know, your brain is all over the place, you know, and that's really what it comes down to. I think just the fact that we overcome cancer, heart disease, and able to stop aging to some extent, that doesn't mean that people are going to live a very, very different life. They're still going to be afraid. They're still going to have biological tendencies that say, ooh, stay away from a cobra, or don't jump off the cliff, or something like that. But yes, I do think we're going to get more radical, and that will make life more interesting. But I think there's going to be plenty enough ways to die. What might actually happen is we might become so obsessed with our immortality per se, or, you know, our ability to live longer, that we might actually be even a safer society than ever before, and more worried about dying in any set of circumstances. You know, I'm already not the biggest fan of driving really fast on freeways, you know, I mean, and stuff like that, because it's like, I know the chances are very slight that I die. Yeah, if I can avoid it, I try not to do those things. And I know a lot of transhumanists are sort of like that. There's other things that transhumanists don't do. They won't have a coffee next to a very busy road because they don't want to have the fumes from cars into their system. You know, I mean, transhumanists take a lot of do a lot of natural things to try to live a lot longer. And I think, you know, that kind of applies to this question of, you know, maybe we're going to become a much more safe society as we gain the ability to live a lot longer, because we now realize we don't want to die. And I think, again, it goes back to this question of religious values. If you believe in an afterlife, you're never going to be that worried about dying. If you don't, and society starts becoming more secular, I know in England it's already quite secular, then, you know, your value of life might be much more than it's ever been. So, you know, I value life because I just think it's the end. And what a miracle that you and I are here talking about these things, instead of me just floating around as dust in the universe somewhere, or, you know, Earth's stardust or something. So I really appreciate and value life, and that's why I try to protect it, because I think it's you know, it was a 1 in a trillion chance that I would be this collection of atoms and neurons having this conversation and promoting this strange field of transhumanism.
But will you at some stage had to face, even if you had to live for 500 years, 1,000 years, or whatever, at some stage you'll have to face the same question of death at some stage, because, you know, we know that in 7 billion years the Earth will disappear, or, you know, like the universe will collapse on some stage, you know.
Well,
Yeah.
Well, I definitely don't think that. I think within probably 15 years we'll have the ability to clone ourselves. And even if it's not exactly me, it's such an exact replica with all my memories, it'll be that person. I wouldn't be surprised if in 20 years we have a closet with an empty, brainless person with exact perfect body. Or we'll have a machine that we can upload. And a lot of people said, well, what would you do if you can upload your consciousness to a machine? And any natural person would say, well, the very first thing I'd do is not just upload one of them, I'd upload 1 million of them. It's the same thing with if you get 3 wishes with from a genie. Your very first wish is, I wish for as many wishes as possible. And I think this idea, once you reach this stage of indefinite lifespans, you try to maximize it with more versions of yourself, maybe even different versions of yourself that intercommunicate and things like that. So I do believe that it's still possible to die, but I wonder if it's really possible once you have all these other technologies. There might always be a version of you out there that's so similar to you that if it was talking to you and I changed seats, you wouldn't know the difference. I wouldn't know the difference. You know, I mean, and I know some people say, well, it's 2 of you, and maybe that's true, but for all practical purposes, it doesn't feel. I still would rather be a second person that's almost identical or identical to me moving forward. And so I think, it's like having children. You feel good because you've had a child. You say, okay, my genes go on, but this is even more. This is much, much more. So I think when you talk about death, it's not only about getting to immortality. It's really how close can you get to it. And some of us are going to try to get 99.8, 99.9% to it. And that could be done through a myriad of different ways of doing it. And I think one way for sure is this idea that, and there's also, for example, another method out there where they're getting so good with imaging techniques, they literally slice your brain basically molecule to molecule through scanning it. And then we have a blueprint of your brain. And if we could later recreate that in a machine, or through just 3D printing or something like that, you then have another replica of your brain at that instant. And it really is your brain because it was exactly the photo of all the molecular and basically subatomic structures at that moment in time. So is that more immortality? Well, yes, it is. If you died and I woke up, I would say, hey, that's me. This is me. And it's really about how you feel about it, and I think I'll probably feel pretty good. I'll say, yeah, it's too bad the other Zolt died, but I'm here, and so I'm ready to move forward.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at deathhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.